YouTube, I'm going to do something different today. I'm going to do a response video to Matt Bell's critique of my hangout with Trey Jadlow, in particular on the section where we discussed analogical language as it relates to thought and God having thoughts and God being timeless. The whole point of that hangout was to offer Trey an opportunity to respond to my objections to his view, and Matt seems to forget this when he does his critiques of that hangout. This was an internal critique of Trey's position, so when I try to get Trey to say something like unthinking thinker, it is in line with Trey's positions on things like an ungrieving griever, which Trey would posit, or an unloving lover that Trey would posit. Matt calls this a contradiction, but in fact this is the way that Trey speaks. So in this response, what I'd like to do is air Matt's objections and see if I can render some answers for him. Hopefully a little bit more so than he did for me. I found his response actually fairly flaccid. He essentially made a 17-minute video with the equivalent argument of "nuh-uh." So hopefully I can present some of his concerns here and address them. Before we delve into Matt's objections, let's just talk about what I was getting at with Trey. So we're talking about analogical language, and Trey's position is that God being pure aseity and the fullness of his attributes with no attenuation is something of which we cannot predicate about properly. That once we predicate about pure being, we are predicating about it in a form of becoming, and so therefore we end up with incorrect conclusions. Now, this all stems from the fact that God must be the fullness of his properties, that he cannot have any parts, that he is pure being, he is pure existence, and that we are becoming, we are constantly changing, but that he is the great consistency within all of existence. This is what Trey means by unity and diversity. He likes to hearken back to Heraclitus and Parmenides and this great disagreement on the basic foundation of metaphysics. The example would be the Colorado River, which is moment to moment never the same river, and yet we identify it as the Colorado River. And so Trey would say that all of creation is becoming, it is created by God and contingent on him, but that God is the fullness of his properties, does not change, does not have any parts, is not contingent on anything. And so God is the great being, and we are the becoming. And in this, he thinks that he somehow resolves the metaphysical issue brought up by Heraclitus and Parmenides. And this is why Trey says that we must use analogical language, that becoming cannot predicate about being properly. And so he says we must predicate about it improperly. But what I'm going to get at is that Trey's language here is ambiguous, that he doesn't know what it is he's referring to, and that no true analogy actually exists. And so my argument is that he's uttering a contradiction and allowing it to go forward based on something that he sees as a more foundational metaphysical need. And it's that I'm challenging, and that what I'm saying is incoherent. With that said, let's go ahead and get to Matt's objections.
You can see there it's titled Analogical Language, but it's not really going to go into that too much, rather going to go into some of the examples.
So in actuality, the entire thing is about analogical language. Trey's trying to refer to God having thoughts, and what I'm trying to articulate is that Trey can't render for me what a thought is for God, not even to the point where we could say it's analogous.
When Bert's critiquing Trey Jadlow, that the critique isn't really valid, and if Trey was more switched on to these matters, then his responses would have exposed that on that there.
So this first part just basically deals with Trey did a poor job and my arguments weren't valid. I'm looking forward to hearing Matt's arguments. Let's see what he has to say.
When Bert says here thoughts require sequence, beginning, middle and end, then he's referring to thoughts in time. He's referring to thoughts as we exist in the universe, as temporal, in a temporal world, as people in time. So so the way Trey answered that was cool. Yeah, thoughts require sequence in time. What would thoughts look like? What would thoughts look like without time? That raises all sorts of interesting questions, like, would it be possible to have thoughts in the absence of time, where you're not defining thoughts in the temporal way, so you just mental event, something like that, or a mental or propositional knowledge or something like that? So it raises all sorts of questions, but the main point is to point out here that when when Bert's defining, or when he's asserting this, thoughts require sequence, that he's doing that within the context of temporality. It's a temporal statement. It's true in time. I wish Trey had kind of played that out a bit more and tried to drive it home. Bert would have a burden of evidence to demonstrate that all thoughts, so if he's going to talk about God existing without a universe, or if he existed timelessly, he would have a burden of evidence to show that all thoughts, whether with the universe or without the universe, with time, without time, for all beings, that all thoughts require sequence, beginning, middle, and end. Because it doesn't logically follow that because thoughts in time require sequence, that all thoughts everywhere, wherever you are, without and with the universe, require time. On that, but good, well done on Trey for answering that way.
So this is the bulk of Matt Bell's objections. Actually, I think it's pretty much it for the rest of the video. He just says it a bunch of times. But so wait, let me just take an opportunity here. I think it's like this, right? Is that what it is? What are you talking about? So you said it's a good question as to whether thoughts can exist outside of time. That's a good question. Yes, that's exactly the question I'm raising, right? The first half of this last portion is entirely my point. But then you say, could there be eternal mental events or propositional attitudes? But propositions have beginnings and ends. Events have beginnings and ends. You progress through an event. An event is not a static state, right? Am I right? So the very terminology you're using is flawed. It's ambiguous. What it is you're trying to refer to is something that isn't an event, something that isn't temporal, right? We're talking about changeless, but all the words you're using to articulate it contradict changeless. And so the burden on me was to demonstrate the contradiction, which I've done. And the burden now is on you to offer me something coherent. Then I will go back into the world and tell you whether it exists or not and give you reasons for thinking it doesn't. But the very heart of my objection is that you can't even talk about these things because thoughts are discrete. So what the hell are you talking about? Okay, so I promised to deliver more than his flaccid critique, so let's take a look at the implications of a timeless, changeless God with eternal thoughts who acts to create. So here we have our timeless, changeless, infinite, eternal God, who is, for all intents and purposes, a steady state. This God is the fullness and perfection of his attributes, and we're saying he has thoughts. Big, long, eternal thoughts with no sequence to them. No beginning, middle, or end. I have no clue what is being posited here, but let's say he has them for the sake of argument. Okay, so this God then creates, and this creation plays out in a time local to this universe. We'll get back to that creation event later. I think there are some problems there. But let's say our timeless God gets this far. This God is still outside of time and sequence, supposedly, and has propositional attitudes according to Matt Bell. Setting aside that a timeless thought would suggest one never gets from the subject to the predicate, would the propositional thought, I have created the universe, be something God would think? And what is the truth condition? The proposition with respect to God's actions can't change tense. There is a state of affairs where God has not created the universe, and a state of affairs where the universe is created. But what does an unchanging thought concerning this tense state of affairs look like? This seems silly, right? So can God not have thoughts about his actions because the thoughts would need to be tensed with the act, and the truth conditions of an unchanging thought would only be satisfied when it was the case? Given that God's thoughts ought probably be true, would not the proper thought be, I will create the universe and I have created the universe? If God is timeless and changeless, how do we talk about his intention to create? God intended and caused. He can't cause prior to intent, right? Intent precedes act. Or does he not intend? What do we say of God's utterances within the tensed universe? God says to Adam after he has created, "Where are you?" Is the truth condition for God spoke to Adam satisfied prior to creating the universe? Is this a timeless thought God would have? And again, what is the truth condition for God's timeless utterances? How does God think about this act of creating the universe and its relation to acts after its creation? Is he eternally acting to commit these tensed actions such that the events occur within the universe prior to the universe being created? That all thoughts and actions concerning the universe are themselves eternal such that the propositional content of God's thoughts are always true. This doesn't make any sense, right? Here's another problem that I see. Once God acts in a sequential manner, there is a standard by which God's eternal nature can be measured. One can take the creation interval, or any interval once this unmoving mover moves to act, and say 2 intervals prior to the universe or 2 intervals after the universe, where an interval is the duration of the universe's existence. We then have a tense standard by which to refer to God's moments in his eternity. There is also a problem, which I alluded to, in the very notion of a timeless God communicating information to this tensed universe. In his utterance, he has a start, middle, and an end to his communication, and it can be said that there was a time prior to God speaking and a time after God spoke. His propositional content is tensed by events in the universe. He cannot offer a covenant timelessly when there is a state of affairs where man has not fallen. Finally, for those screaming about simultaneity with respect to the instantiation of time, if there is a time where God acted to bring about the universe, while the universe's time would be the effect of God's causal act, there must be a time antecedent in which the cause occurs. The effect of the universe with its time cannot precede the cause to create the space in which the cause can occur. Further, one would think that God's intentions precede his act to cause, unless it's the case that God doesn't intend his actions. And as if all of this isn't bad enough, I haven't even discussed how it is a timeless God enters creation to save it.
Now, when you get to the third one, a God is posited as having thought. Trey comes back with an answer I don't think is very good. God thinks in a different way, or not as us. I mean that if thoughts could exist without a universe, and God has thoughts, then what Trey is saying is correct. But that's there's a better way to answer that. You could say, so a God is positing having thought. He could have asked the question, well, what do you know? He could actually refer back to his first statement when he said in time. He could say, well, a timeless God is not posited as having thought as you defined it in time as thoughts requiring sequence, beginning, middle, and end. So it depends how you are defining thought there. So if you're defining thought in the same way as the first one, then no, a timeless God is not posited as having thought, because that's a temporal thing. And then Bert would have to have then answered that and said, well, yeah, I mean, he would have to engage with that kind of reasoning, and the only way he could establish his point would be to show that all thoughts, with or without the universe, in time or without time, require sequence. And I don't think that's a burden of evidence that he could hold.
This is the extent of Matt's argument, and I'm not going to go any further than here. I'd just be rehashing the same points. I'll leave a link to his video in the description. Hopefully you see how pathetic this is. They haven't stated what their definition is for a thought for God. They haven't articulated a position. They haven't offered something in lieu of a temporal, discrete mental state, as we would define thoughts for ourselves. Which is my whole point regarding analogical language. There's no analogy to be made here. This is like saying a car is analogous to the color orange. In what way do they connect? Thoughts for God, it would seem, do not at all connect to thoughts for us, such that we shouldn't even call them thoughts. Matt's response amounted to, we can offer timeless thoughts, and the burden is on Bert to remove such a notion from possibility. Well, when you're uttering contradictions by referring to timeless events and sequenceless propositions, the burden of squelching the notion of timeless thoughts is satisfied. You're not referring to thoughts or anything analogous to thoughts when you posit them as timeless.
That just makes no fucking sense. I mean, it's just bullshit.
So you are on the hook for putting a coherent concept on the table and for demonstrating why it is you think it's the case. I have said clearly why it is you're not talking about thoughts or thinking, but you haven't even addressed the basic burden of what it is you even mean. It is a nebulous brown nugget that you're offering. And they either need to describe how it's otherwise, or use a different word for God's thoughts and thinking. Because it's not analogous to what we're using, and I don't see how they can make any sense of it, which is my entire point about analogical language. If there is no touch point, then what the hell are you talking about? If you're contradicting, why not allow the contradiction to describe your God and say that he's within a meta-time where he acts? But then I guess you run into other issues you don't care for. In any case, I'll leave this little dose of Ambien in the description box, and please take a look at it. I do appreciate Matt taking a look at my views. I just wish that he'd offer something a little more substantive than nah. And thanks for watching.
Fuck. Oh my.